This video is prompted by a conversation I saw on Facebook, and we had a conversation on there with some beginners who posted that they didn't think that the Bag of the Month Club could be for them because they thought that the bags were too difficult and weren't beginner friendly, and they found that they had a few questions that maybe weren't explained in the patterns because they were kind of general terms that most bag makers knew unless they were completely fresh. So first off, I'll just mention a couple of other videos I have which might be useful. I have one on interfacings, and I also have one about using rivets. First things first, thread and needles. With threads, it says on them usually what weight they are and usually what they're made of. This one here is a polyester. It also says it's number 40, which in this case isn't the colour reference, just got to be careful of that. 40 is the weight, and that's actually a good weight for bag making, I think. It's a stronger thread. You might choose to use cotton in your linings, because if the lining does start to pull away and you have a cotton fabric lining, it means that the stitches in the thread will break instead of ripping the fabric, which is much harder to repair. But for exterior bags and for making sure that you've got nice strong stitches, I recommend polyester. Usually the three types of thread out there that you'll see in most sewing shops are polyester, cotton and rayon. Rayon I find is the hardest to use. That's good for dressmaking, and cotton is great for quilting, but yeah, I would usually recommend the polyester thread, and I wouldn't go any thicker than a 40 weight, so I wouldn't be going for a 30 or anything like that unless I was working on something super thick, such as maybe 2 or 3 layers of Peltex, and it comes in so many different colours and lots of different makes, so there's lots to choose from. Needles. Now needles are the complete opposite of thread in that the higher the number, the fatter the needle, so the heavier the needle, whereas the lower the number would be a thinner needle, so it's the opposite way around to thread. Needles usually come in like these little boxes here, and they have numbers next to them. This one says it's a jeans needle, and at the bottom it says 100/16. I generally go by the first number, but 16 is just another way of recognizing the number, so 100 is equivalent to 16. So the 100 size needles are quite thick. You're not going to need anything thicker than that generally. For quilting I tend to use these 80 needles, 80/12, and then of course there's one in between, the 90/14. Sometimes I will use these if I'm making an applique quilt or something like that, where I have a bit of glue and a few layers going in there. So for bag making I generally stick to the 90s, and microtex needles are good as well if your machine is struggling using universal needles. And if you're also sewing with vinyl or leather, you can get leather needles too, and they're just a little bit sharper. Don't buy ballpoint needles, they're for knit fabrics. Alright, different things you might see written in patterns that aren't explained. You might see on occasion WST or RST, and these are related terms. RST is right sides together, and WST is wrong sides together. So that would be, this is a bag I'm making right now, so this would be the right side, because this is the side with the print. Right sides together would be when you're sewing two bits together, you can see the back of the fabric, the wrong side, because those right sides are sandwiched together, and equally wrong sides would be the other way around. Generally you will usually sew right sides together, but it depends on pockets and layers and things like that. You might be mixing it up a little bit, so they're two important things to know about. The other thing is seam allowances, and you should pay attention to the actual pattern individually to know what seam allowance to use. Most patterns I've found are 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I have come across them that are 1/4 of an inch, and I think that's because of the crossover between quilting and bag making. You can get 1/4 of an inch foot for your machine, which will help with that, but if you have other sizes it can be a little bit hard to keep track of what that seam allowance actually is. I like these sewing edges. They're little plastic purple strips, and they're sticky on the back, and you peel them off here. This is sticky, you can stick it down to your machine, so once you know where your 3/8 mark is, you can stick that in place and the fabric will butt up against it because it's reasonably thick. You could also use several layers of washi tape or something like that to mark on your machine bed, but I find that really useful. You can also use it for any seam allowance size that you need. Sometimes you might see in dressmaking patterns, for example, 5/8 of an inch. And on some patterns I've come across 5/8 or half an inch seam allowances, and then you trim the seam allowances afterwards. So just pay attention to the pattern. Top stitching is normally done at 1/8 of an inch, and what I normally do is eyeball that using half of my 1/4 of an inch foot. So how do you know which bag pattern to choose? You might think that a pattern looks easy and then it's not, or you might think a pattern is difficult because it's got a zipper in, but actually it's a good beginner pattern. So for example, this is the Blanche Barrel bag. This is what I would call a difficulty, a sort of more intermediate to difficult level bag, and that's because it's got piping. I would avoid any bag patterns with piping if it's your first bag, but don't dismiss the zippers, because most bags will need a closure of sorts, and zips are one of the easier fasteners to try out. And a lot of bag pattern designers have a free pattern on their websites, and I recommend downloading those even if it's not a pattern that you want to actually make, just so that you get an idea of how the designer writes those patterns and you can see if that's something that works for you, because some use pictures, some use illustrations. Going back to types of bags, this one is the Miss Maggie handbag by Emmeline Bags, and this is an easy bag to sew, and I believe it's a free pattern too. This one doesn't even have a zipper at the top, but it does have some slip pockets on the inside and magnetic snap, so it'll show you how to attach those. It also uses the bag anchors, and there are a few different types on the Emmeline Bags website, and it has some snaps on the ends as well, just to kind of close that up, and bag feet. So there are a few bits of hardware there. There will be a few things to learn from that pattern. It's a nice easy one to start with, but do check out other bag designers. There's Swoon patterns, there's Blue Calla patterns, Bag Stock, Andrew Designs. There's lots of bag pattern designers out there. If you make a bag and you think, oh, this isn't right for me, this hasn't worked out very well, don't worry, because you can always take apart your hardware, reuse it. And every bag that you make is developing your skills. It might feel like a waste of time, but it's not a waste of time. You have learned about the process, so it's definitely worth being brave and jumping in. And also, the next time you make that pattern, it's going to be 1,000,000 times better. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about. I would avoid using vinyl in your very first bag, just because it can be a bit more difficult to work with. If you unpick vinyl, the holes stay in the vinyl. It's just like leather. Once you've punctured it, that's it. Whereas with cotton, it's a bit more forgiving. So I try and stick to cotton if it's the first time you're sewing up a pattern, or if it's the very first time you're making a bag, and then you'll be a lot happier with the results afterwards. I wanted to talk a bit about some of the hardware you can get as well. There are different rings, and you might wonder why. So we have rectangle rings, we have D-rings, which are obviously D-shaped and rectangle shaped, and O-rings, which are round and O-shaped. And these will have different situations when you will want to use them. Rectangle rings are great when you've got strap to strap. So this is just connecting it from one piece to another. These can rotate at times, so you might want to use an O-ring instead, because then it doesn't look ugly and out of place. Vinyl, however, if you do choose to sew with vinyl, tends to hold those rectangle rings in place better and gives a more professional finish. Now a D-ring is better when you've got a piece of hardware, a hook attaching to that D-ring. If you had a rectangle ring, I'll show you what would happen. This clip would go onto the rectangle ring, and then it would struggle to know where to hang it from. Is it going from the corner? It's going to kind of twist a bit. It's not going to hook on straight, whereas that curved edge gives it something to actually lift from that's central. So that's when you would use a D-ring, and make sure that you keep your eye on your pattern and use what the designer recommends. The O-ring can be used in most situations as an alternative to either of those. It's just more of an aesthetic thing, and they're a little bit harder to find as well. So D-rings and rectangle rings tend to be the main ones. You can also get triangle rings, and these are a little bit harder to find as well, but they look like this. So they're doing the job of a D-ring, because you've got that curve for the hardware to snap onto, but then you've got a nice flat edge to go alongside, inside the fabric that's holding it to the bag, just like a D-ring would do. Mag snaps come in 4 pieces. You've got, it'll say on the pattern which side to insert at which time, but you have a male one which has a little outie, and a female which is the innie. So they're the 2 main components. They have these little stems on the back which go into the fabric, and then you bend those prongs outwards. When I was first making bags, I didn't know to bend them outwards, I was bending them inwards, and that creates bulk behind the hardware. So fold them outwards. You can also reinforce the holes by putting a little bit of scrap batting or fleece on the back of these prongs as well, and then folding them. And then you can also fuse a piece of interfacing, like a piece of any scraps of interfacing you have, to the back there to stop those prongs from rubbing on your lining fabric, because that's usually where these prongs will go up against. The other parts of the mag snap are these little discs, and these discs are where your prongs go through, and then you'll fold it back. So these go on the back of every mag snap piece, but they're also very useful for being able to mark where you want this to go. So when you have a little mark on a pattern for where your mag snap goes, it's usually a little dot or something like that. You can then position your disc over that dot using the circle in the middle, and then you can draw the 2 little lines either side so you know exactly where to cut your prongs. So I think I've covered most of the basics on bag making. Some bags do have a lot of pieces, so maybe you want to avoid one with a lot of pockets, because I find those really tedious to cut out, and that is the worst part, I've got to be honest with you, is cutting the fabric out. So you will just pay attention to the instructions, take it one step at a time, and you'll find it pretty easy, to be honest. Just choose a decent pattern so that you're not challenging yourself too much to start with, and then keep building your skills from there.